Hey there, welcome to the Tech Tuesdays webinar on what's new in Cloud Application Integration 2020 releases. I'm Brinda and I'll be hosting today's webinar. This presentation will cover the features and functionalities that have been or will be released as part of Cloud Application Integration releases in 2020. It will also showcase some of these features through a demo that would simulate a real-life use case. The speaker for this presentation, Saurabh Agarwal, is working as our Principal Product Manager in Informatica Cloud Product Management team and is responsible for managing products like CAI, ActiveOS, Cloud Extend, and DBO. Before we start, here are some housekeeping tips. Today's webinar, as usual, is for 1 hour that includes a 45 minutes webcast, and then we'll move over to live for 15 minutes to answer your questions. All dial-in participants will be muted to enable the speakers to present without any interruptions. Your questions can be submitted through the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we will be addressing them to the end of the presentation. The webinar will be recorded and will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel, the Success Portal, and the link will also be emailed to you. Please set aside some time to complete the post-webinar survey and provide your feedback and suggestions for upcoming topics for the Tech Tuesdays webinars. The Tech Tuesdays webinars is a webinar series introduced within the Success Portal. The Informatica Success Portal is a micro-learning platform that offers free and unlimited learning to all registered users. The Success Portal lists your success offerings, your customer success manager information, bookings available in the Ask an Expert session, and customized recommendation and content. Our new intelligent virtual assistant Diana is available in the Success Portal for all our cloud customers. Over to you, Saurabh. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Saurabh Agarwal from Informatica Cloud Product Management team, and today I am going to take you through all the new features that have been released as part of Cloud App Integration releases in the first half of 2020. There have been two releases in the first half of 2020. The first release is what we call Spring 2020 release. It's releasing in month of April and May 2020 on different parts. There are two exciting features coming as part of this release. One is called Operational Insights for Cloud App Integration Assets. The second is to do with OAuth 2.0 authentication and authorization for Cloud App Integration APIs. And then I'll move on to January 2020 release, in which we released many new features, and we will cover them as part of this demonstration. Let's move ahead. I'm going to first talk about operational insights for Cloud App Integration. With Spring 2020 release, you would be able to monitor your Cloud App Integration assets as part of operational insights offering. With this feature, you would be able to monitor Cloud Application Integration assets. This would be available as part of Operational Insights, where you will have a separate page for Cloud Application Integration assets monitoring, and it will offer several charts to help you quickly and visually assess the status and usage of CI assets, and at the same time view analytics related to the API calls, processes, connections, and licensing. There is one prerequisite for this feature. You must have the application integration license and being able to view the application integration matrix. So with that, let's move on to the demo. Let us log on to Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services platform. To assess this new monitoring capability, you should choose Operational Insights, which is a service meant for monitoring various kind of assets on Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services platform. You see multiple tabs here. The home page gives you information about the overall infrastructure summary in terms of monitoring. You also see a tab for data integration, and you also see a new tab for application integration. So let's click on that. You would notice that there are multiple tabs here. One is overview and processes and usage. Let's talk about these one by one. On the overview page, you see multiple panels. The first panel is for activity. Activity panel displays the total number of completed and faulted processes in your organization in the last 24 hours. It also shows the percentage increase or decrease in the number of completed and faulted processes since the last period. You can use the activity panel to assess whether the fault trend is moving upward or downward. Let's look at the second panel, process run by environment. The process run by environment panel displays the total number of processes run in your organization for all runtime environments. By default, the panel displays information for last 24 hours, but you can choose a different time limit, either last 7 days or last 30 days. You can use the process run by environment panel to assess whether there is a need to perform load balancing across runtime environments. The incoming API calls panel displays the number of hourly incoming API calls for the last 24 hours. By default, the panel displays information for the top 5 processes with the most incoming API calls, but you can choose others as well. You can use the incoming API call panel to gauge incoming traffic and identify peak and off-peak hours, at the same time to identify the optimal time to perform system maintenance. The overall API response time panel displays the overall API response time in milliseconds for all the processes and for all runtime environment in your organization. An increasing overall API response time indicates degraded performance. It can also mean that these APIs use complex integrations and might have degraded third-party connectivity. Let's look at response time outliers. The response time outliers panel displays the top 5 processes in your organization whose API response time is higher than the average API response time in the selected time period, and the choice for this could be made here. By default, the panel displays information for the last 7 days. Processes whose API response time is higher than the average API response time could have complex integrations. Comparison of the values against the average API response time in the last period helps operator assess how the processes have been performing since the last time period. Top 10 running processes panel displays the top 10 processes in your organization with the most runs. By default, the panel displays information for last 24 hours. You can use the top 10 running processes panel to identify the most important processes in the organization that might need better optimization than the other processes. The panel also displays the average number of processes run in the last period compared to the current, which gives a trend indication for operators. That completes our overview page. So let's move on to processes page. On the processes page, you see 2 filters. You can make a time-based selection, either last 24 hours or 7 days, 30 days or 3 months, or you can choose the environments. You can either choose all the environments, cloud only, all agents, or any specific agent here. What you see here are 3 different reports which are available for all these processes. Either you can look at all the processes in your organization. You can also notice that it gives you process name, the number of execution, the runtime environment, average execution time in milliseconds for last 24 hours. But again, you can make a choice here to get the information for the last 7 days. You would notice that once you made a choice from 24 hours to 7 days, you get a longer list because you have more processes running for the last 7 days than 24 hours. You can also choose different reports, for example, completed processes. This gives you an indication of how many processes have completed successfully and what are their average execution time and the runtime environment. But more importantly, you want to look at the faulted processes, the number of executions that have failed, and probably you can take corrective action based upon the failures here. Let's move on to the usage tab. Within the usage tab, you have multiple tabs like APIs and processes and connections and licensing. You would also notice that you can look at a monthly based data. So you can choose based upon month if you're looking for getting report for the month of April versus March or February, you can do that. So this gives you a more fine-grained way of monitoring your system. Let's look at different tabs here. If I choose the data for April 2020, let's look at the first panel, daily and cumulative incoming API calls. This panel displays the number of daily and cumulative incoming API calls. By default, it displays information for the current month and all runtime environment. You can use the daily and cumulative incoming API calls panel to assess whether there is a surge or dip in the incoming API calls and accordingly plan for peak traffic. The incoming API call process, it displays the number of daily incoming API calls for selected process or process category. By default, the panel displays information for the current month and the top 5 processes with the most incoming API calls. But you can make a choice here. Next is incoming API calls by runtime environment, where you can again make a choice based upon top 5 runtime environments. You can choose the environment that you are looking to monitor. This panel displays the number of daily incoming API calls for selected runtime environment or runtime environment category. By default, the panel displays information for the current month and the top 5 runtime environment with the most incoming API calls. You can use this panel to assess the load on different runtime environment and probably perform load balancing or increase the security and capacity. Let's move on to the processes tab. First panel, daily and cumulative process runs, displays the number of daily and cumulative process and sub-process runs. By default, it displays it for current month and all runtime environment. You may want to use this panel to assess whether there is a surge or dip in the number of process and sub-process runs and accordingly plan for peak traffic. Process and distribution panel displays the number of daily processes and sub-process run for a selected process or process category, and by default displays information for current month and the top 5 process with the most runs. You may want to use the process run distribution panel to find out the most important processes that might need better optimization than the other processes. Process runs by runtime environment. This panel displays the number of daily process and sub-process runs for a selected runtime environment or a category of these environments. By default, it displays for current month and the top 5 runtime environment with the most process runs. You can use this panel to assess the load on different runtime environment and perform load balancing or increase the security and capacity. Let's move on to connections tab now. The first panel, which is daily and cumulative connection calls, displays the number of daily and cumulative connection calls for the month as displayed here and for all environment. You can use the daily and cumulative connection calls panel to gain insights into connection usage. Connection call by endpoints. This panel displays the number of daily connection calls for a selected endpoint or endpoint category. As you would notice, there are different categories highlighted here. You can use the connection calls by endpoint panel to find out the most commonly used connection endpoints. Next is connection calls by type of connection. This displays the number of daily connection calls for a selected connection type. You can use the connection calls by type of connection panel to find out the most commonly used connection types. It helps you assess whether there are more connections calls made to on-premise systems or cloud-based systems. Connection calls by runtime environment panel displays the number of daily connection calls for a selected runtime environment or a category. You can use the connection calls by runtime environment panel to assess the load on different runtime environments and decide whether load balancing is required. Now let's move on to the last tab here called licensing. On the top panel, you see the usage statistics. This helps you assess whether the total number of API transactions for all the runtime environments in your organization falls within or exceeds the maximum API transactions count defined in administrator for your application integration license. If the total number of API transactions exceeds the defined maximum API transaction count, the chart indicates a difference as a percentage value. Daily and cumulative incoming API calls to trendline panel displays the number of daily and cumulative incoming API calls for selected runtime environment or runtime environment category. It helps you compare the total number of API calls against the maximum API transactions count defined in administrator app integration license. By default, the panel displays information for the current month and all runtime environments. That concludes our demonstration on operational insights for cloud app integration assets. With that, let's move on to the next feature, which is OAuth 2.0 authentication and authorization for cloud app integration APIs, which is to provide a secure way of accessing cloud app integration APIs. The question arises, why do we require OAuth 2.0 authentication? Oftentimes, you don't want to provide your username and password to your API consumers because that creates insecurity. But rather, what you want to do is you want to control it by creating an OAuth client and provide the client ID and client details to the user so that they have specific permissions on the API that they are calling. So now with Spring 2020 release, you can enable OAuth authentication for managed APIs that can invoke a cloud app integration endpoint. Key things to note here is that it only supports client credentials as grant type. Uh, your Cloud App Integration process or the API endpoint should be using basic authentication, and your Cloud Application Integration API endpoint cannot be called directly using basic authentication. While we will do a demo here, but let me talk about the steps that you have to follow to enable this authentication. Obviously, you will need to have a Cloud App Integration process exposed as an API, which is enabled for basic authentication. You can create a managed API and then create an OAuth 2.0 client under API Manager Policies Authorization. We will see this in action in the demo. You need to save certain key information like client ID, client secret, and auth header for future use. Then you would request for access token invoking the OAuth server URL, which you will get from the OAuth client page. Then you would request for access token invoking the OAuth server URL with client credentials grant type, and then use either client ID or secret or the auth header as a basic token. And this in turn will give you an access token as a JOT token. And then subsequently you will use the JOT token as a bearer token to invoke the API endpoint. With that said, let's jump into the demo. What you see on your screen right now is a very simple process. This process takes in an input and gives out an output, which is concatenation of hello with the input that you provided. Important thing to notice here is that this process is set for basic authentication. You would also notice that there's a new checkbox here which says only accepts HTTP authorization request from the API gateway, and we will talk about this as well. But this process right now can be invoked directly using the CAI endpoint. So let's publish this process and let's try to invoke this process. I copy the endpoint from here and invoke it. As you would notice, this worked. It printed a message on the screen that says hello world. Now let's look at how do we activate that feature where you only are able to access this API through an OAuth 2.0 client. So let's click on this checkbox. With this, it will only accept HTTP authorization requests from API gateway. Let's save it and publish it. You would notice that there's a new message on the properties detail page which says that it can only accept HTTP authorization requests from the API gateway. Let's try this out. Let's copy this URL and let's invoke it. This time you see an error message on the screen which indicates that this process only accepts requests from the API gateway. Now this API cannot be called through the CAI API endpoint. Let's see how we can call this API using the OAuth 2.0 client. For this, I will go to the API manager. For this, I will go to the API manager. Here you see all the APIs that have been created on this platform. Let's search for our API. Here is the REST endpoint, the API proxy from the API manager for this API, for the REST interface. Let's create a managed API for this API. And let's get the properties of this API. As you would notice that we have various authentication methods here, basic OAuth 2.0 and JOT web token method. Let's choose OAuth 2.0 and save it. Now we need to create an OAuth 2.0 client. For this, let's go to policies and the authorization tab here. You would notice there's a button called add OAuth 2.0 client. You can obviously use other clients here, but let's create a new client. You need to first pass the username and password. Then provide the details like the client name. Let's call this as a hello world client. Then some description. At this point, you can make a choice to either use this OAuth 2.0 client for all the API resources or selected APIs or the API groups. Let's restrict this client to the API that we are working on, which is hello world. So I choose APIs and API group option and only choose hello world. Let's search for that first. So let's choose it. Next. At this point, you see your client ID, client secret, and authorization header value. Let's make a note of this. You also notice that there's an OAuth 2.0 server URL. Let's copy the URL as well. Now we have all the information required to call this API using an OAuth 2.0 authentication mechanism. Now let's go to Postman to try this out. As I mentioned before, you have to first get the authentication token, which is going to be a JOT token from the token URL. Let's paste it here, and let's provide the header here. Like I mentioned, there are two ways of providing the header here. Either you can use the authorization header and pass in as a basic token. For this, you will need to use the auth header and send a request. You will notice that it says missing grant type, so let's provide the grant type as well. Grant type equal to client credentials. And the request. You will notice that you have the access token, which is a JOT token here. Also have the token type, which is a bearer token, expiry date, and the scope associated with this token. You could have done the same by not passing the authorization header, but passing in client ID and secret as username and password. So let's try that as well. There is a client ID, and let's pass the client secret as well. The request, and you're going to get back the same thing, a JOT token, token type, expires in, and scope. Now let's call the API, copy the URL, paste here, and pass in the required parameters. Now we need to pass the bearer token as authorization header, one that we got from the last API call. The JOT token here, bearer token, and the request. And here you get back the responses, hello world. So this marks the completion of our second and the final demo for Spring 2020 releases features. I'll now move on to January 2020 release features. The first one being creating process objects by importing schema definition from XSD, WSDL, or Swagger. All of us are familiar with the process objects in Cloud App Integration. Cloud App Integration lets you define the complex data types using process objects. So process objects serve as a template or the metadata for a complex data type. And today in Cloud Application Integration, these are created manually by using the UI where you can define them. But over time, these objects can get very, very complex because they can have nested hierarchies, they can have many of those fields, and it becomes very, very difficult for anybody to create them. So as part of January 2020 release, we now offer creating process objects by importing either a schema definition or an interface document. So these schema definition, for example, XSD, have a definition for a complex type which we leverage. And similarly, in the interface documents, for example, a WSDL or a Swagger file which define the metadata definition for a service. These have elements and objects that are also very similar to a process object as they define the complex data type. So what users can do? Users can create multiple process objects in a single shot using the UI. As we will see, this UI is very, very friendly. It is very intuitive, gives you a lot of information. And by virtue of using this wizard or this UI, the process objects that you create can be nested and hierarchical. It all depends upon the schemas that you're importing from the files. Like I mentioned earlier, you can create process objects by importing schema definitions, for example, XSD, or the interface documents, for example, WSDL and Swagger, since these have the elements which qualify as a complex data type. In the future, we might support more of these formats, but for now, we support XSD, WSDL, and Swagger. What more, you can provide these documents either as a URL, because most of the times they are available as a remote URL. They may also be available as a local file, and in case they are more than one, it will make sense to actually have them into a single zip file so that user need not perform this operation again and again. So we also support the zip format of importing process objects. These process objects, we understand, could be many, given the fact that the XSDs or the WSDL or the Swagger that you import could have many, many such schema definitions. So we let let the user tag them, and we let them prefix it so that they can discern it easily from other process objects. And then these process objects, needless to say, can be used as a template for complex data types and shared across all the cloud app integration assets and not just scope within a specific asset. Uh, so we will follow this up with a demo, but before we move forward to the demo, I also want to give you some resources in this regard. So you can always refer to Informatica documentation, the links for which I mentioned here. This will give you more detail on a step-by-step process on how do you create process objects by importing the WSDL, Swagger, or the XSD definitions. You can always reach out to the Cloud Application Integration community, which is a very vibrant community where you can seek answers for your queries. You can ask questions, you can search for content, and you can find content as per the relevance. With that said, let me show you how this feature works on a live setup. So now I'm going to be logging into Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services. This is the login page. So let me log in. I have already created a project called Create Process Objects here, where I would be storing all the process objects after import. In order to access this feature, you have to go to the familiar New dialog and then go to Process Objects. You will see a new entry here called Process Object Creation Patterns, very similar to the way you can create service connectors. You will see there are two options available. You can create from WSDL or XSD, or you can create from Swagger. Now in our case, we are going to use a live WSDL file available from the Salesforce Marketing Cloud, formerly known as ExecTarget. And this opens up a friendly UI wizard which will take you through the steps of how do you perform this operation. So the first step is to select a source. As you would notice here, the source could either be a file or it could be multiple files which are zipped together, so it's a zip file, or it could be a URL. In our case, since we are going to be using a live WSDL, I'm going to be using the URL here and paste it here. This is the URL from the Salesforce Marketing Cloud WSDL. Doesn't require authentication, but in case you do require authentication, you can use the use authentication checkbox here and fill in the details. In our case, we don't require. On next. And at this point, tool will figure out how many files are available within this URL, which have the schema definitions, and that these files are supported or not. Looks like there are two such files available, and both of these are supported because it's WSDL or XSD, and both of them are valid. So they are supported file types. At every point you will find related logs. At this point there is no logs to display as we have not started the parsing procedure here, but at every point you will find them here, which you can also download using the download option here. So going back here, clicking on next. At this point you will get to know the schemas available within these files. The first file has 345 complex types and the second one has 2. But given that we have so many complex types available, there is an option to either prefix them so that you can better discern them from other process objects and tag them for better searchability. Given that this is coming from Salesforce, so I'm going to be using the prefix SFDC for both of these files, schemas, and I would be using Salesforce Marketing Cloud as a tag name for both of these schemas. Again, you can check the related logs here. It gives you information on how the things are working behind the scenes. So it converts the WSDL file to one schema resources, and you see those parts available here. Clicking on next, it's going to generate the objects. As you would notice, there were 347 overall objects that we found as part of these two files, and these objects were as per the names here, and the description is also provided. This is what would be filled in the process object. This is auto-generated, and that's what the description says here. It also details on how many fields are available within these process objects once they are created. And again, you have an option to change the tag name if you want to, or you can customize a specific object name with a different tag or add additional tags here. So we'll keep them as is for now, but you can again look at the related logs here to see how the things worked out behind the scene. There were a bunch of warnings here, but more or less it looks like the things went through fine. When we click on next, and at this point it will give you a summary of what's going to happen when we generate these process objects. So 347 process objects will be generated. They would be located in a specific project folder here. I'm going to change that so that we have better readability. I'm going to use the project create process objects. If at this point, if I want to add additional tags to this, I can still do that. So let me try that. Let me just give a tag name called demo and start import. Now once it start import, it's going to take some time because we have many process objects to be created here. So you can choose to run this in the background by dismissing this dialog, or you can stay on this page and let this dialog finish. It's up to the user's choice. In my case, I'm going to dismiss it so I can continue doing my work and come back at a later stage to see if the process object generation has completed, which should be available here as part of the notification. As you would notice here, there's a new notification here which says that process object importing has been finished, and 347 process objects have been created successfully. That's a notification for me to go and check if all things went through fine. So I go into the create process object project here and look at the objects being created, and I do see there are 347 new objects being created. This folder was empty initially. Let's look at a couple of things here. As you would notice, we had used the prefix called SFDC. So all these objects have been prefixed with SFDC. There was a tag that we had used. We had used two tags. The first tag was Salesforce Marketing Cloud when we were creating it, and you see it here. And then second time we used the tag called demo. Let's look at another process object here. So let's look at SFDC asset. As you would notice, this is a complex process object which references other process objects here, and it's valid. And once that's been done, you can use these assets across your cloud application assets and start building complex integrations. This concludes our presentation on creating process objects by importing schema definition. Now let's move on to a very exciting new feature, which is to define the test data as an input for a process, and that you can run the process with one or more inputs. Let's jump in. With this feature, you can define inputs for a process, and it's very useful because if you can define inputs for a process, you can define unit tests for a process. Definitely helpful for a developer. Let's talk about this feature. Now user has the capability to create, read, update and delete these tests or the inputs in context of a process, and they can do so using a friendly UI that gives them all the options to perform these actions. Choose the fields, they can give the test a name, they can define multiple tests, they can edit a test, and they can do a bunch of other stuff, as we'll see in the video shortly. User has the choice to run all of these tests as a test suite before they move it to QA environment. Developer may want to perform multiple tests on their own implementation, and eventually they end up building a lot of tests, and they can choose to run a single test, or they can choose to run the whole test suite at any point in time. Good part here is that they can do so from the process designer itself without leaving the confines of Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services platform. Earlier they would have done the same thing by going to a REST client or a SOAP client, for example Postman, where they would run a test and then seek back a response. Now they can persist the same information within the process designer for a process. When you run these tests, one test or multiple tests or the entire test suite, it will create its own process instance, which is available like any other process instance under processes listing. It's very easy for developer to debug if there is a problem. And these inputs or developer unit test are part of the process metadata, and so they are persisted during export input process as well. Before I move into demo, I also want to talk about some of the resources that we have available here. So with this feature, we have accompanying documentation available, as you can see the links here. So please use them to your advantage. You can always leverage the rich and vibrant cloud application integration community where you can seek information on a specific problem that you are looking forward to fix. You can ask questions on community, and you can search for relevant content. With that, let me move on to the demo. This is our Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services login screen. So let me log in. I already have created a process that I want to use for the demo. Process name is CAI process demo. Let me talk about the process first, what the process does. In this process, user is asked to provide two pieces of information, an item name and item count, trying to place an order. Item name and item count are text fields. These fields are fed into another service, the get inventory details service. This service takes the field name, takes the item name, and then gives out information as to if the item is found, or if the item is available, then the details of the item. If the item is available, it will find the cost price of the item. It will perform a multiplication with the count of the units that were requested for this item, and then eventually update the status and the transaction cost. In case the item is not found, it will set up a status that the item was not found. So it's a very simple process. The basic thing to note here is that it takes two input fields. You will also notice that there are other fields which have been used here as temporary fields. Total cost is a process object, and that rounded price is a text field. Now, where you can find the capability to define the unit test, if you go to the actions menu here, you will see that you have an option called run using. If you were to click on run using, you are presented with this new UI. In this new UI, you already see that we don't have any test available right now, but you have the means available to define any new test. As we noticed before, the input for this process were the item name and item count text fields. So you have the capability to define a new test and fill in the values for this. For example, let's say I fill in the value as item 1, and let's say the count is 2. I can choose to fill the value either as a JSON, or I can fill it as an XML. I can save these tests and delete a test, and I can perform validation on this test. Let me save this test. When I perform a save on this test, ask me for the process input test case name. So I'm going to be giving it the name of item name, which is item 1. And once I do that, I get to see this listed under the drop down here. And I can define more tests. So let's do that. Let's define some more tests, and you can click on the new input button here. Define new test, at which point you would be presented a new screen. Define the name of the process input. Let's say the name is item 2. Save it, and then fill in the values here. And the count is, let's say, 4. Save it, and this also gets listed here. Now let's define one more test. New input. Call this foo. Save it, and then define the field values here. So it's foo, and the item count is, let's say, 5. Now we have 3 tests available: item 1, item 2, and foo, with their respective values. If you wanted to use a process object to define your process input, you could have done that. You just click on the process object here. As we see, there's only one available here, total cost. You can click on add and get the values here. In our case, we don't require, so we will not use it, but in case you need to use it, you have the ability to use them here as well. Okay. So with that done, let's run all the test input that we have. So we have 3 here. Run all and starts the process execution. Now, as you would notice here, there is one successful execution. So we had 3 tests. Each of these tests created their own process execution. One of them succeeded, the other 2 failed to execute. So let's go and look at the process listing. I can very well click on the successful execution, directly go and directly go to the process execution. So let's do that. Notice that the process execution ID ends in 096. Okay. My processes tab. You would notice here that 096 is the one which succeeded, and there were other 2 which failed. You would notice them here. Let's look at the successful one, which is 096. It's already open here. You will see the check marks here to indicate the flow of execution, like you see for any of the normal process. You also see the input fields available here. Input field that we passed here was item 2, and the item count was 4. Get inventory details, returned back that the item was found, and it got the values of the item, and eventually it performed its normal operation. You would notice that you are able to see the variable values at every point in time. For example, the temporary field here, the rounded price, the value is 20, performs a multiplication, and then eventually assigns it to output, the output being 2, status which says complete successfully, and the transaction code which is 80. Because we had 4 count of the unit item 2, and we had each unit costing 20, the transaction cost is 80. Now let's look at the failed or the faulted processes. Let's look at the faulted one. Let's look at this one. As you would notice that the item was not found here, and so it failed and faulted. There's one more point to note here, is that if you were to export this process, let's do that. And download the export package here. And look at the content of the package. You would notice that the test data is preserved across export import. This would be available here. Test foo, the test item 1 and the test item 2. So it becomes very easy for developer to persist these tests from development to QA, and this can really become your regression test suite. This concludes our presentation on defining test data for a process. Now let's move on to the next topic. It's about how to make your process recovery easier with the process restart from the app integration console. So like I mentioned, with January 2020 release, you can restart a process from the process listing page. This process listing page can be either from the My Processes, which is the developer perspective within the process designer, or it could be from the application integration console service. There are certain restrictions on who can perform this role, and that's purely based upon the use case. So the first restriction is that a process can only be restarted by the users which have admin or operator role. Typical use case is that you have multiple jobs running in production as part of production deployment, and one or more of these jobs fail in the production run, and administrator and the operator who is managing the system does not have a fair idea on what the logic is and why certain things failed, and they also want to have very easy mechanism to at least do one retry of a failed process or a faulted process and being able to figure out if things are fine now, if the issues were intermittent in the first place. So it's extremely useful to debug an instance failure with a specific input, and that's where it's going to be used the most. And there are certain prerequisites for this feature. The process should have run at least once on the cloud server or on the agent. That's the first prerequisite. And for a process to be restarted, it should be in one of the following states. It should be either completed, or it should be faulted, or it should be suspended. We also expect the tracing level of the process to be set to normal or verbose to be able to perform a process restart. And if a process contains attachment, then we also want the persistence level to be of type full or persist. So these are some of the restrictions that we have in terms of which process can be restarted. Before I move into the demo, I also want to show you some of the resources that you can use and learn more about this feature. So you have your very own Informatica documentation available at this link as given on the screen. You can use this link to get more details as to how the feature really is implemented and how it should be used. But beyond that, if you have any questions and queries, you can always refer to Cloud Application Integration Community, which is the place where you can seek information by asking questions, or you can search for collateral. Either you can look for KBs and video articles or how to documents to your answers. Let me give you a brief demo of this feature. This is the Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services login screen. So let me log in first. Open a process that we want to execute. I'm going to execute a process called CI process demo. This process is a REST-based process and requires authentication. It requires two input fields called item name and item count, and it gives out the transaction cost and the status as output for this particular process. Let's also look at any invocations of this process prior. Under the My Processes page, as you see here, there is nothing that we have listed here. Let's fire this process by getting the endpoint information and then calling this with the right details. I'm calling it with the item name as item 1 and item count equal to 2. And this process completed successfully. If I were to go to the My Processes page and look at the process listing, I should see a process completed. What you would also see here is that there's an additional icon in the process listing page for this process where you can restart this process. And when you click on the restart, it's going to start a new process instance. Also finished successfully. Now it doesn't really show much when the process is already complete successfully, but if the process is faulted, and let's try that scenario as well. Let's give it an item name which does not exist in the inventory. As you would notice that the process faulted here, and you will see the process is faulted. If a process is faulted, you can still restart a process. Click on restart, it will start up a new instance, but even this will fault because it is going to accept the same inputs, and the inputs is what was causing the failure or the fault of a process in the first place. But if your process had faulted because of intermittent issues, and when you restart them and those issues are gone, then this process would have succeeded. It's really useful feature. It's very useful for administrators and operators because now they can perform a restart and hope that the intermittent issues have been resolved and that the process or the production jobs will be completed. That concludes our presentation on process restart. Let's move on to the next feature. I will talk about two new features, which is about making it easier to consume databases. The first one is how you can turn your ORETA enabled database into a fully fledged REST API, which will also have its own auto-generated Swagger definition. And the second one is about how your ORETA enabled APIs can now be accessed from either cloud, on-premise, or both. With this, we have come to the end of our presentation. But before we leave, we want to give you some more resources. So with January 2020 release, we had many more features which we did not talk about in this presentation, but you can find more details at this link. The post on Cloud Application Community. Feel free to browse over this post and get more details on what additionally came in January 2020 release. I would also recommend that you look at Cloud App Integration Online Help and strongly recommend that you should leverage the Cloud App Integration Community, which is a collaborative user platform to share and seek information quickly. You can ask the questions on the community and experts can answer these questions. At the same time, you can also search for relevant content, be it a video or document or a sample, KBs and how-to, etc., which will help you move ahead with your projects. Thank you so much. Take care.
So we are open for questions. Please post your questions in the Q&A box.
Hey, this is Saurabh. I'm the presenter. I hope the presentation was useful for you folks. If you have any questions, can you place them in the Q&A box, and probably we can answer them right now. I have already answered many of these questions when the presentation was on. The most common question that I've been hearing on the Q&A was about the OAuth. One of the questions was, do we need to install the OAuth on the SS server, the secure agent server? The question is no. This is on the Informatica Cloud. There is no need for you to do the installation of the OAuth server yourself. It comes as part of the API Manager service. Another question is that how do we capture the details on the ops site for the CI assets? So all the traffic which is passing through the secure agent or the Informatica Cloud, the transition data is captured, and that's how we get to know about the statistics that we display on the ops insight dashboard. Another question is there a way to use the OAuth in a process deployed to secure agent? The answer is no. Currently, as per the demo, OAuth server is available as part of the API Manager service. And in current form, API Manager does not proxy the CAI process APIs hosted on secure agent. And that will change soon. In our upcoming releases, we will actually be able to proxy the CAI process APIs, which is on the secure agent. But as of now, given the fact that we don't proxy them, the services which are on the agents, we don't allow OAuth for such processes. One more question on the chat window on the Q&A box is OData 4.0 fully supported? Yes, it is supported. Adjoining question is when will we be supporting OData 4.1? We don't have an answer to that question, but something that we can place in our roadmap for the future. Another question is, can you use OAuth as a part of a data integration task flow which will consume CI APIs exposed through API Manager? Well, in the future, we are looking at API manager / API gateway being the source of all the APIs that are created on the Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services platform, and when that happens, then OAuth will start supporting them as well. As of today, if you really want to support a DI task flow in the context of the OAuth, or you want to leverage OAuth authentication, then you have to wrap them within the CAI API, CAI process and expose it in API. And then these are available as part of the API manager managed API, and then you can leverage the OAuth capabilities there. The question is, will you have a way to archive cloud process log to an on-premise DB? Really don't have an answer to this right now, but probably I can send this back offline. Brinda, I presume that we're going to be sending this transcript of the questions out to attendees in the future?
Sure,
right?
sure. I'll do it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think I already answered this question, but for the benefit of the group, let me answer this again. The question is, how do you call the OAuth as part of DI task? Like I mentioned, DI tasks are not exposed as an API, or they are not proxied as an API through API manager. So what you can do is you can wrap them up in a CI process and then leverage the OAuth via the API manager. The question is, I tested resuming task flow which is faulted but resumes in all modes. Well, the session is focused on CI cloud authentication, but I can probably answer this question as well. We are looking at enhancements in the area of task flow, especially in terms of resuming and recovery and fault handling. So you might see a better behavior in the future.
We have some more time for the Q&A. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. The recording for this webinar will be present in the Informatica Success Portal and also the YouTube channel. The deck will also be available to you.
So folks, you have a couple more minutes to go before we end this webcast. So please place them in the Q&A window. There is a loaded question. Do you have a roadmap of what will be in the future release? Well, I have an idea on what's going to be coming in the future release, but nothing that I can share in this forum. We will continue doing our enablement sessions as we always do through webinars and our presentations, and that will give you a glimpse of what's coming in the future in different products and services areas. Last 1 minute. there's a question, can someone create a demo of how to call a managed API deployed using OAuth through a DI task flow? Well, the way OAuth works today is by using the JOT token through an OAuth client, which is pre-created, by calling up a URL, which is the authorization server URL, and then being able to use the API output, which is the JOT token, as a bearer token. So it's definitely something that we can automate. But it is something that you can do through a CI process and not through a DI task flow, because CI process lets you perform orchestration and it can make service calls to different APIs. So that's something that you can do. And while we don't have a demo of that on our community, but probably something that we can do in the future. We can post something on our community around this scenario and maybe have a demo for you.
Sure. Thanks, Saurabh. Looks like we have answered most of the questions. If we have failed to answer any of your questions, we will get back to you after this presentation. Thank you for joining for this webinar from all around the world. Hope you are safe. Thank you. Thank you, Saurabh, for
thank you.
spending some
I hope.
webinar. Thank you.
Thanks.